Hi everyone, I'm Liz Barry, and I'm here from the Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science. And I'm so honored to be here with you at MaD, especially on this panel, The Making of Meaningful Work. I have to say that my own work history has taken some twists and turns, and I could tell you some stories, but I'll just tell you one about my first job out of college. After I studied urban design, I got a job on Wall Street, not at a financial institution, but at one of the world's largest architecture and urban design firms. And we created plans for entire cities where there were none. We created plans for cities where there was not even land, just open ocean. Reclaimed land is something Hong Kong knows about well. But all of it was done without a social context. And I began to feel that designing cities in this way from Wall Street was like just making another financial product instead of making a place where people lived their lives and raised their families. So when the global economic collapse came and that kind of work dried up, I lost my job. And I surprised myself by how happy I was. Because I had already moved on. I was already looking for ways for people to shape their own cities, for people to participate and to have local control over their own environments. Something I like to call a civic science. The movement was already growing, and I was able to join it. I picked up a new hobby that involved big kites, long strings, and cheap cameras to improvise satellites, kind of like the one you see in the upper right-hand corner, but a lot cheaper. And a large group of people found themselves having to put their hobbies into applied practice when an environmental disaster happened off the southern coast of the United States, the BP oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon. And as soon as the oil started to flow into the Gulf of Mexico, the government closed airspace. And what that meant was that no journalist could get the story out. And people who lived on that coast and fished in those wetlands, who knew that land the best, had no idea what was coming. So we equipped the fishermen with these improvised satellites. And from that boat, we launched cameras 1,000 feet into the air and collected the highest resolution aerial images, enough to count the birds on the sandbars and enough to identify the oil sheen spreading throughout the Gulf of Mexico. At 8,000 pixels wide, this citizen-produced data far outstripped what was available via public satellite. All 8,000 pixels at 3-centimeter resolution could be dwarfed within 1 pixel of what we're seeing now in the background of the daily MODIS satellite imagery. So the whole story unfolding on a local level where the citizen voice was the critical component. And these maps, when we stitched them together, went around the world on syndicated media. So the transparency of having the vessel from which the people who actually collect the data were riding led to a transparency and a revealing aspect in the data itself. We were able to report that oil was reaching the shoreline despite this white line, which is called boom, which was supposed to absorb it, and is shown here to be totally failing, and that was not known. So our hobby, which was this improvised, low-cost setup, we paired it with free online software that we wrote to help anyone be able to stitch their aerial photo into a map. And then we created a public data archive so that data collected by individuals could be issued in the same languages of power as other data sets issued by governing authorities. And then we had to take a minute to think about what we were doing. We had very much inverted the typical citizen-government relationship, which you can see, tokenism, placation on the lower rungs of this, what's known as a ladder of participation by Shelley Arnstein in 1970. And what we were looking for is higher up, partnership and citizen control. So this model we created, the improvised hardware, the web-based software, and a public data portal, it became very popular. Folks picked it up in New York City, here shown documenting after their sewage infrastructure failed from a big hurricane, and the bacteria bloomed and turned the water opaque. So not only were they out documenting the pollution, they took advantage of a hunch that they had, that there was still fresh, clean water entering from along the edge of the canal. And they were able to prove that fresh water still existed, and this citizen-collected data actually changed federal policy that was governing this urban waterway. Some small farmers got a hold of this idea, and they went further. They modified the camera to infrared so that they could understand how different parts of their crop were performing more or less strongly, so that they could intervene long before it was time for harvest, long before they came up short. And this same infrared imagery we call infograms can also be used to distinguish certain types of species from another. Shown here is a rural community that's trying to manage invasive species on their lake, and they began by mapping them to make their management plan. We expanded from cameras into webcams and smartphones and made an attachment so that we could analyze the light passing through samples you took from your environment to figure out what chemicals were there. And this is being used in the Gulf Coast, where people are frequently living just over the fence line from oil and gas refineries. Shown here, they're improvising a tool where you look at night at the plume to discover what chemicals are being released, to hold industry accountable for human health problems. So this model has become even more popular, and I could tell you a million stories about what's going on in the public laboratory community, which is now 5,000 strong around the world, and maybe plus one or two more after this talk. But I want, because of who you are here in this audience, you are entrepreneurial and innovators. I wanted to share how we actually do this. So I'm going to stop talking about what we do, and I'm going to start talking about how. The whole community discusses on email groups. Okay, simple. When we make progress in our research, we document it on a social field notebook. And anyone who lives close by to each other meets in local meetups. Yes, we work on the tools, we write the software, we host the data platform. But beyond that, people have become very active, nominate themselves to a community leadership group, and get on the phone once a week to help steer the direction of all of Public Lab. We hold an annual conference where everyone comes together in person. The interesting thing is that we don't set an agenda. People come together and collaboratively figure out, what do we need to talk about? For individual projects, for instance, tracking invasive species in a lake or monitoring refinery flares, individual projects can now directly fundraise through Public Lab to get support. And we maintain an organization with staff, and we all run on consensus. So towards the idea of making meaningful work, if you have been unhappy in a hierarchical situation, think about what you will create. And I want to say it's possible to have a flat structure, one team member, one vote. With that kind of accountability, we run Kickstarter campaigns for our tools to progress beyond the prototype phase and reach a broader user community. And once a tool has matured and become stable, we make a production run and actually host it in our store. And all of these activities are reported to a board of directors that keeps us responsible to our mission, which is to make environmental science something that anyone can do, especially in the face of environmental injustice.